All right, it's World Series time of year. It's baseball, the end of baseball season, and out of the big panels, I guess we're batting cleanup, which is where you always put your power hitters, and that's what we've got on this panel. I'm really excited. So Ari introduced me and the role that I play at Intel. I'm also honored to be the chair of Ari's board for the coalition, and want to thank Ari and Michael for trusting me to get out the messages and lead a discussion about risk management. Ari trusted me so much to be able to do that and that I would get everything right that he took the pains to write a 13-page paper and put it in front of you so that you can actually get the real answers later, I guess. But I've read it. I hope you all will read it too. I think it's a fantastic piece of work talking about how risk management can be implemented and how a lot of countries around the world are now implementing it. So with no further ado, let me introduce the panel. The bios are on the table also. So just quickly, Adam Sedgwick is the Technology Policy Advisor for the Office of Policy and Strategic Planning at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Then Avi Rembaum is the Vice President of Security Solutions for Checkpoint Software Technologies. And then we have Belisario Contreras, who's the manager of the cybersecurity program for the Organization of American States at the World Economic Forum, and Amanda Craig, the senior cybersecurity strategist from Microsoft. So I think we've had for the entire day a number of the speakers talk about risk management and the need for risk management, but they haven't gone into a great degree of depth. I thought particularly Commissioner McSweeney's comments, where she talked about the need to have flexibility, and she was talking about it, I think, generally in terms of our Section 5 of the FTC Act authority for unreasonable and deceptive trade practices, and having the need to define reasonableness within that for how you would define the unfairness standard. But I think that same need for flexibility is something that has given rise to the need for us to have risk management framework. So working at Intel, one thing that's been very obvious to me over the 20 years I've been there is I think it was always true, but I think it's increasingly true that legislation and regulation trail innovation. And I think that's even more true in the cybersecurity area than it is in a lot of other areas. I believe that risk management frameworks are one way to try to address that. And I would say, as is echoed in this paper, one of the efforts in risk management that has done an incredibly good job of laying out an approach that can be taken was the approach taken by NIST. And Adam, if you could give us a bit of that history and talk about where that's headed, that would be great.
Sure. So I won't go into too much detail on what the framework actually is because Ari's paper covers it pretty well. But I will talk about some of the policy drivers that got us there and some of the next steps. So the way I think about the framework and why it needed to be developed is because in 2013 and earlier, policymakers were faced with this really difficult challenge of they knew that there were best practices and standards out there, but they couldn't really figure out why they weren't used more widely. And particularly at the time, why aren't they used more widely in critical infrastructure? So there was a big debate over what were the right ways to get organizations to improve their practices. And through the course of a couple of years, we ended up with this approach where NIST would serve as a convener to bring together stakeholders to figure out what are those sets of best practices and standards that need to be promoted more widely, and what are the mechanisms we need to do to help organizations use those, and then really critically, where are the areas where there are best practice and standards gaps that we need to begin to work to fill. So that's kind of what went into the development of the framework. The approach we took was one that was really actually based on other approaches that NIST had taken earlier. For folks that don't know much about NIST, it is the technical arm of the Department of Commerce. It's also a national lab that's focused on industry needs, and we're also focused on measurement. And in addition, we have this role of standards coordination. So the U.S. is unique in that for every regulatory need, we have a law that requires departments and agencies to go to international standards bodies first, figure out what's already there, and when possible, collaborate through those mechanisms to help meet that policy need. Some of that's to get at the challenge that you talked about, David, where regulation tends to be trailing innovation and what industry is doing. So the approach that was taken was really based on how can we look to these international standards and other guidelines. How do we develop open processes so it's clear that this is being driven by industrial needs and not government needs? And so that's how we looked at it in terms of where we're going from here on. The framework was developed, it was completed in 2014. We're actually in a process of updating the framework and looking to what improvements should be needed. That alone gives us a really good opportunity to re-engage with international stakeholders, because the message isn't just, we developed this thing, why don't you use it? It is, why don't you come and work with us to improve it so it better fits your own needs? So that's where we are. We will have an updated version in the next few weeks that we'll post out again for public comment, and we hope to have that completed version in the next few months.
Great, thanks, Adam. So your comments about the reliance and the connection to looking to international standards, one of the benefits I've always thought that we get from that is a sort of unifying and common language that an international standard could provide. Amanda, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the value that comes from there and the need for it.
Sure, thank you. Yeah. Oh. Forgot to turn this on. No, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for that. And I think it's a really interesting way to kind of think about the practical use of the framework going forward. I kind of want to just take a quick step back before I jump into that and give some context around Microsoft's use of the framework, because that's really informed, how, our perspective on, policy discussions about cyber risk management, about the framework, and then kind of get into a little bit more about what we're seeing happening globally in terms of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. Government's kind of increasingly focused on those areas and some of the sort of risks and opportunities that we see from that. And one of those being kind of the opportunity to have more alignment across sectors, or the risk of seeing sort of fragmentation across sectors, across jurisdictions. So on Microsoft's use of the framework, we've integrated it into our enterprise risk management program, which means that we have a program office that manages sort of framework-based assessments across more than 20 business groups, and then discusses those assessments with our security leadership team, with our board of directors. And when I talk to the folks on that enterprise risk management team about why the framework works for us, they have a kind of a really consistent set of messaging. One reason I think it works is it really does kind of provide a consistent or common language, common taxonomy that they can use to have more consistent conversations across organizational silos and subcultures that it's hard to get around. A second reason is that it really operates at different altitudes. So from kind of the functions to the informative references, we really see that it can help to sort of bridge security capabilities discussions from the sort of boardroom context to the control owner. A third reason is that, to the point that both of you raised, it incorporates international standards, other informative references that Microsoft's already using. So for our teams that are participating in the assessment process, they can have existing data that they can plug into those assessments, and it's more of a lightweight, manageable process. And then the fourth and kind of final, and the thing that I hear the most, is that it's really not a compliance exercise. It's not about a binary assessment. It really is a tool that can help senior management understand security posture, really have visibility in and to engage on sort of risk prioritization, and also commit to a continuous improvement cycle that has some agility for changing technology, changing threats, and changing security capabilities. So kind of using our experiences as my starting point and reflecting on kind of the broader policy landscape, I think there are a couple of kind of aspects of what we think works about the framework that are relevant to that kind of broader policy discussion. One is the importance of really being grounded in a risk management approach, enabling continuous improvement rather than just focusing on compliance. And a second aspect being kind of enabling that kind of common language, consistent conversation, and also being able to leverage those sort of common reference points, all being really relevant to some of the policy discussions that we're watching globally, whether they be kind of governments that are actually in the process now of developing legislation that's going to impact critical infrastructure protection, like Singapore's draft cybersecurity bill. We are also tracking everything that's going on with Europe and sort of the implementation of the Network and Information Security Directive. And there are also lots of other developments around the world in which governments are kind of signaling interest in this space, right? Whether they're kind of referencing the need to do something in the critical infrastructure space and cybersecurity strategies, or developing centers like Australia, I think earlier this year was that they stood up a new critical infrastructure center. And sort of seeing all of these sort of developments, seems like there is a real opportunity for governments to get involved in a positive way and help to improve security by kind of promoting risk management approaches, as well as enabling that sort of common language or pointing to common reference points. And that's going to have multiple sort of positive impacts. One is on the global and horizontally integrated supply chains, and just enabling those supply chains to keep functioning, and potentially also helping to improve the conversations that are happening between suppliers and buyers about cybersecurity, about risk management. And the flip side of that being, there's all this government activity. If governments go in the direction of more prescriptive approaches, more sort of static compliance-focused approaches, there's this risk that not only kind of undermine investment in risk management, but also have that kind of fragmentation across jurisdictions and across sectors. And probably running out of time, but just one example that I think is really interesting. In the UK, they recently published their public consultation on their plan for transposing the Network and Information Security Directive. And the NIS directive is in part going to result in security requirements, incident notification requirements for operators of essential services. And in the UK, they're, at least in the current plan, taking the approach of having different sector competent authorities for different sectors rather than having sort of one competent authority. And they kind of discuss this approach in the plan and say there are kind of benefits and drawbacks to having one competent authority versus sector-specific authorities. But there's really interesting sentence that says something like, we acknowledge that there could be multiple operators of essential services that are kind of falling under the remit of multiple competent authorities. And so we encourage those competent authorities to kind of be aware of that and to encourage consistency. And it's really interesting language because it kind of just points at this issue and the need for sort of cross-sector baseline approach to cyber risk management.
Yeah, interesting, which is something also Commissioner McSweeney commented on, at least proposed her solution in the United States, which was some sort of a comprehensive law that would give the FTC more jurisdictional authority to do that. More difficult when you're talking, as you had mentioned, about across jurisdictional lines, and it's difficult enough within one country, but across many countries. Belisario, that's, I'm guessing, what you are seeing in Latin America, and I was wondering if you could talk about how that's going.
Yeah. Hello? Is it working?
Raise it up a little bit.
Now better?
Start talking and we'll see. Go on, start.
Yeah. No?
Hold it and talk into it.
Try holding it.
Bad. So, yes, thank you. Actually, thank you, Amanda, for pointing out. You mentioned Singapore, Australia, UK. Latin America and the Caribbean, actually, the reality could be quite different, actually, in other developing countries. And what I was saying, the internet and cybersecurity issues are different in these countries like in the United States. The United States is a really advanced country, and Europe is a really advanced country. And incidents are not happening just from the US or developed countries where you can easily mitigate. You can take the phone, or you already have, in theory, the line of trust and everything much easy. In Latin America and the Caribbean, although there has been a growth of 2,000% of internet users over the past decade, and countries are getting more interconnected, the reality is that there is still much to do on cyber issues. There are just 7 countries out of 32 that just have a national cybersecurity strategy, a national cybersecurity plan, and that's really scary for us. There are a number of computer security incident response teams, but the level of advance of those teams maybe is not as advanced of those like the USR, of course, or of those in Europe. What we have tried to do is we have already started with certain studies, certain assessment on how the Latin American and the Caribbean region is doing, and we find that the level of maturity is in a nascent stage. Of course, there are countries like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay that are doing well in certain areas, but there is not enough. There are areas in like legislation or technology, education, that they still have a lot to do. And this should matter actually to the United States, because if you think a country like Panama has a critical infrastructure like the Panama Canal, where most of the trade of the world goes through that single thing, and 5 minutes, 1 minute, or 1 hour without the Panama Canal will have a huge impact in the US, Europe, and China economy. And you'll think, how is the cyber security of the canal? And you might be surprised. And there are, of course, other major critical infrastructures throughout the region, throughout the Americas, throughout Europe, throughout Asia, that maybe the US companies, probably like Microsoft, rely on. Actually, I'm happy to say, well, with Microsoft, we are about to launch actually a study on CIP. It's going to be in March in Panama, probably at the Panama Canal. And we are working actually with other private actors. With Amazon, we actually just signed an agreement. We are working with them. And the approach that we are trying to have in Latin America is try to make sure that the policymakers and the decision makers understand this issue and actually begin making investments on these issues. Is really hard because there are many priorities. They need to prioritize between health, education, and cyber, and sometimes it's very difficult. And again, this is a global issue, and this should be a shared responsibility for all the countries.
So I think your example of the Panama Canal is a fascinating one, right? So, this concept that there are certain aspects of infrastructure that not only could have such a tremendous impact on the country within which they reside, but could have global impact and have a need for a lot of players who potentially would not have the ability to impact whether the organization takes and puts in place certain measures, but they need to rely upon the fact that they did. And Avi, I was wondering if you could maybe take up that issue and talk about if there are a lot of players that need to rely upon the fact that risk management is being done and being done effectively. Does that mean we need some level of a verification or certification mechanism? And what's the role for government, do you think, in that type of an environment?
So does my microphone work, by the way? Yes, no? Excellent. So it's a fascinating question, since government ultimately provides in some ways can be the stabilizing effect, plus also the underpinning. So Ari, in your white paper, you refer to, even within a cyber risk framework, if the project is voluntary, there still might need to be some underpinning legal framework to define certain things. And certification and creating some level of a universally applicable standard is something that government can do without, however, being overly obstructive or limiting. And I think we're seeing something evolving in Europe that might serve as an interesting test case. And so the General Data Privacy Regulation, or GDPR, is coming to the fore as something that is defining in many ways the relationship between an individual European citizen's ownership of their personal information and the ways in which other entities on a global scale interact with it. And what was done within GDPR was in some ways very European, and I'm neither European nor a lawyer, but what they did was they created the concept of the fundamental right of an individual's ownership of data as being something that is cross-border. And the individual, they have ownership of their information. They control its portability, which was something that we heard earlier today. And then also beyond that, they also have the individual European citizen has the right to access their information at any point in time. And then wrapped around that are a series of specific guidelines for obfuscation of data and the ways in which certain entities have to approach the development of a risk management framework for the protection of data. And so sort of creating that underpinning that there's this fundamental concept is something that government can do, and sort of standardizing it. But then they take it another step and add a level of variability to it by leaving it up to individual countries and their certifying authorities, which haven't yet been established, to determine the rules for that individual country. So then you have the opportunity for variance, which builds off of sort of this standard universal concept. And then taking it another step further, they then establish it that any company anywhere in the world that owns or processes the data of a European citizen must comply with the rules of GDPR. And then the final step is they create the upper bound ceiling of a fine of up to 40% of a company's turnover or their gross income. 4%, sorry, yeah, 4%. If you take a look at the Equifax breach, right, on the one hand, the 4% number, thank you, Ari, seems like a very high number, but it actually comes below what the projected estimates would be for Equifax's cost of dealing with this breach. So I think the estimates range from somewhere between 200 million to $1 billion, something along those lines. Equifax, I think their 2016 revenues were 3-point-something billion. So if you take the 4% rule, that comes in at 120-something million, which means their fine just for that would be less than the potential cost that they might have to bear for dealing with it. So on the one hand, sure, it's a lot of money, but it's not necessarily the end-all of all sums.
And not the only incentive for taking actions to avoid the incident.
Right.
Nor not just the only, it may not be the largest one if you're looking at the potential impact, including in the Equifax situation of senior executives having to step down, be fired from their jobs.
That's correct. What's interesting, though, is Equifax's stock, after it plummeted immediately following the announcement of the breach, has since recovered about a third of the loss. And if you take a look at Target post its breach, it immediately had a negative effect on its stock price, but about 2 quarters later, I think, had stabilized and was even above what it was at before. And so I think the cost associated with it is something that becomes very relevant. But your initial question about whether or not government can provide a role, it certainly can, in that it can create a system of incentives, and it can also create a system of common themes that various entities in the private sector and in the public sector need to try to adapt to. Sort of a long answer to your short question.
Well, but it makes me, I want to come back to something that, Amanda, you had touched on. So we talked, we were just having a conversation around government incentives and government certification and verification. But you also mentioned the implications for horizontal supply chains. And that makes me think that, I remember one of the things I thought that was fantastic that Michael and Ari and others in the Obama administration did was the event at Stanford in Palo Alto, and a number of announcements that companies made of things that they were going to do to use the framework and to further the framework. And there were several companies, Intel being one of them, who said, look, we're going to integrate this into our supply chain. We're going to integrate this into our guidelines and procedures that we ask our vendors to comply with, because we're reliant upon our vendors. They're going to create risk potentially for us. And so you have a separate mechanism then that's outside of the government for assigning risk and having some sort of incentive or disincentive. And Amita, I was wondering if you could, or if any member of the panel could talk a little bit, the degree to which you think that that's potentially going to be effective, these private ways of assigning risk using the framework.
Could potentially be really effective, right? It's one of the many kind of tools that are relevant for the discussion about how to kind of promulgate these best practices, right? And so, definitely think it's something that is really valuable, that organizations can use something like the framework kind of throughout their supply chain. We can also think about the government using the framework as part of the contracting and procurement requirements, and kind of in the same way promulgating best practices through those sorts of incentives. I think it's really interesting because it kind of points back to the problem that I opened with, right, which is that if you can have common approaches across different government initiatives, then it does enable you to kind of have the ability to promote them throughout your supply chain and across sort of vertical sectors. Or from our perspective as a provider to multiple sectors, as those organizations are kind of rolling down requirements to us, and as an ICT provider, allows us to operate as a kind of provider to multiple different sectors. But if you have the inverse happen, and we do see that kind of fragmentation, then it limits the ability to have that kind of ripple positive impact throughout the supply chain.
Yeah, so there's an interesting, I think, corollary process that's also taking place. So as companies are implementing cybersecurity framework, they're also looking to private companies to measure what the internet believes of an individual company's cyber risk level. So there's like the security scorecards and the BitSights of the world that are starting to enter into that space. And if you look at the way that some of the larger retail companies are acting today, they've begun to leverage the internet's view of a supply chain partner's perimeter security into their contract process. So they will or will not select to work with a supplier if they score very poorly on what the internet thinks of their security level. And we've been playing around with some of the historical data on companies that have experienced breaches to align what the internet at the time thought of that specific company or government agency's perimeter security level. And you start to see what appears to be a pretty interesting correlation, not causation. Going back to Equifax as the example, the incidence of struts, publications, and exploits tend to align pretty nicely to the various phases of the breach that they experienced. And if you go back to the SEC 2016 breach, the internet's view of the SEC's perimeter security controls plummeted just at about the same time as when they announced that they had the attacks on their servers consistent with the Edgar result filings. And so there's an opportunity there for things like the cybersecurity framework to align to analyses of the internet's view of a company's actual cybersecurity controls. And if those can be brought together, there might be a very powerful combination that industry can leverage.
Can you tell me a little bit more, everybody else may be getting it, what you mean when the internet's view or what the internet is saying?
Sure. So a classic example is in Amsterdam. Amsterdam, a few years ago, decided that they wanted to connect their drawbridge management system to the internet, sort of a classic industrial control system, kind of a smart city maneuver. And the day that their drawbridges were connected, someone who installed the systems forgot to change the default password of one of the routers and switches that were connecting the system together. And so, of course, when the system was turned on, a bridge went because someone found it on the internet and said, oh, look, what can I do to this thing? And sort of very quickly modified it. And so the internet isn't this independently thinking entity, although at some point it might become it. But it's a series of people who have sufficient scanning tools and spiders and all sorts of bots that continually track and look for new systems that appear on the internet, and things for the most part are mapped and all sorts of fun and exciting stuff. And there are sufficient companies today that for services will compile multiple feeds together based on operating system, sort of standard vulnerability assessment processes. Operating system levels, specific ports that are open to the internet, sweep scans, port scans, presence of various exploits and vulnerabilities on systems, and compile them together. So I use the term the internet. It's not actually the internet. Rather, it's the elements that are on the internet that people can access that are publicly available.
This is fascinating because I think what I'm taking away from this is that this idea that we have internal implementation of controls, hopefully through some sort of risk management framework, and then we're going to see these external indicators are going to point in one direction or another on how well those are going. Now, the thing that seems difficult to me about cybersecurity is you could be doing a fantastic job and still end up having a problem. You could still have the drawbridge go up. And so you get an indication, but if we're trying to affix some sort of blame or some sort of determination of whether somebody has acted as what Commissioner McSweeney would say in a reasonable fashion, it feels to me like you're going to need some common language to figure out how to talk about that, and even to be able to do that across jurisdictions and within countries that run in very different systems of government, some of which where you might be talking about the infrastructure that we're most worried about might be state-owned enterprises, actually, instead of being privatized. I wonder if anybody on the panel has any comments about how across that great diversity of jurisdictions do you end up driving a common language so that people can understand what's reasonable and unreasonable?
So I guess I would say a couple things. One is that I think, to your point, a lot of organizations are trying to figure out the best ways to essentially document their security programs and the decisions they made and the justifications for why they made those decisions. I'm very interested by the number of times that industry will come to NIST and have that conversation about sort of that process. And part of that is for legal liability risk. They want to be able to document that while something may have happened that they didn't anticipate that led to an incident they didn't want, they still had a very robust process to show that they'd had due diligence in their systems. So I think that's part of what we're seeing in the industry, and I think we talked a little bit about supply chain, and I think the point about some of these other internet companies are interested, but we're also seeing things like the framework being used in auditing, accounting, and insurance environments for the same ways. And then I think this same question of sort of across sector and across organizations, the minute that you implement it in your supply chain, I think you are looking at different thresholds than just is it in a particular sector. So the value in having a common lexicon, it helps organizations, particularly when regulators in some sectors, such as the financial sector, understand the same challenge with supply chain. So they're not only interested in what are the practices that you've implemented internally, they've also started asking a lot of questions about vendor risk management. So if you talk to the OCC, when they went and did their evaluations of small banks, the number of times they heard their bank say, well, cybersecurity is not really our issue. We outsource all of our IT. Led them to really think differently about how they provide their guidance and start asking those types of questions. So that's sort of at the implementation level. I think to your question about how do we break down these barriers, I will also say that we take this sort of discussion to a variety of multilateral forums. to try to get other countries to think about risk management and how they implement this. So, for example, at G7, the ICT conference, they didn't have a very long summary of agreement, but it did include the countries working together on promoting risk management and risk management culture out to industry. So it has become really a focus in those top-level conversations, and I think part of the hope is that will filter down to help provide approaches that are more consistent, unified, and based on international standards.
I will just add that it will be ideal that everyone will speak the same language, that we will use the same terminology. But I think that's still a challenge and will continue to be a challenge for several years, not just in terms of regulation, but also in legislation and even basic technical issues. We were, for example, working with the different bank associations, at least on the region, and basic things about what is an attack, what is an event, what is an incident, they were not able to find a common understanding. So if they are not able to find common understanding on those little issues, it's very difficult to have a more common understanding on more deep and substantive issues. And I point out the banks because, of course, they are more developed and mature markets. So in the ideal world, the preferred, it's a common understanding at a common framework would be great, but I think we're still far away from that.
So, Adam, I want to pick up on something that you had said that right at the end, which I believe that Belisario was also touching on, was the need to use international standards as a mechanism to advance that. And, I think this is where that plays at multiple layers, I think, right? Because you've got references to international standards that are within the framework, and then there's possibilities for international standards, I guess, to be used as a mechanism for the implementation of similar approaches to the framework. And I was wondering if you or any of the other members of the panel could talk a little bit about what you see as where we're headed with the interface between international standards and risk management frameworks.
So I actually think Amanda is tracking it a little more closely than I am, so I'll defer to her. I mean, I think, I guess on one point, which is that, we've talked a little bit about sort of different sectors and different sector needs and the need for a broad-based approach, but I will say one thing that's very interesting, and one thing that we can use to our benefit is that the sectors also have very different perspectives they have very different needs. So we talk about international standards and its importance, but a lot of industry, particularly in critical infrastructure in the US, they just aren't international companies. So they are less inclined to turn to international standards because they don't really have a business driver. So when we turn to industry, if you look at how we always talked about the cybersecurity framework, the idea is that we would develop it, but not maintain it forever. But every time we turn to industry to have that conversation, a lot of folks who became very accustomed to working with us pushed back very hard on the idea that it would be turned over to a different type of organization. So it's
a consequence of your own success.
It seems to be, yes. So it's still a conversation we're having. How do we best have that balance? Because, and I think it even goes when we have these conversations with other countries. Some countries are a lot less likely to use it because it's maintained by a organization that ends in .gov. But for other countries, the fact that it is a U.S. and U.S. government approach actually is enticing and gives a promise and makes it more likely that they can sell it among their stakeholders. So I think some of the work that we're trying to do through ISO, that Amanda can explain more, is really our efforts to try to have it both ways, because it'll give us an ability to mirror some of the activity in an international standards body, but continue to do some of the work at NIST with our stakeholders here. And it's really not that dissimilar to, the work that we've been doing for a very long time in cybersecurity, while we develop these standards and guidelines for federal use, we, to the fullest extent possible, try to move it out to international standards bodies as quickly as we can. I'll turn to Amanda for.
No, I just would kind of agree with the premise of the question and some of what Adam was getting at, that there's really clearly a lot of value for NIST having a role here. Like Adam indicated, there are governments that are going to be interested and looking directly at what NIST is doing. There are governments that are going to be wanting to be able to engage, even though NIST has been very proactive in trying to bring in governments and have them participate in things like the update process and the initial sort of framework development. There's a different way, a different mechanism for governments to engage in something like an ISO IEC context, and some are more comfortable potentially leveraging what comes out of that process. And so there's just a really interesting development going on on ISO SC27 right now, in which they're developing a technical report that is really well aligned with the cybersecurity framework, kind of has a structure really similar to the framework core. The main difference being that the version that is being developed within this ISO SC27 sort of subgroup is that all of the informative references are ISO and IEC standards. And so it's really, when we think about the goal of having better alignment across jurisdictions and across sectors, something like this ISO technical report could be a really valuable reference point, not only for multiple governments to kind of point to and leverage to get that alignment across jurisdictions, but also across sectors, because we have things like IEC standards that are included. So for industrial control systems, there'll actually be reference points that are really relevant to them. So really excited about it. ISO 27103, I think, is the number. So look it up. I think next week at the SC27 meeting, there'll be a decision about sort of whether to keep working on it or whether to go forward with the version that exists now. But potentially a really interesting reference point coming out the end of the year, early next year timeframe.
Great, thanks. I'm told by Ari, it's time to turn out to you all to ask some questions of the panel. Who's got a question? We need to get you a mic, I think.
Hi, Arnaud Tadei from Symantec. Sorry, I just joined late today. I'm not from the US, I'm from Switzerland. I report to the office of the CTO, and I'm responsible for standards. Fact is that I'm a new chairman at the ITU on Study Group 17. I listened to the discussion here and realized the standard aspect, which is indeed important. Last week in ITU, we had an interesting 3 days on blockchain, right? And listening to the problems you have, I was wondering what would be the impact of blockchain from including standard perspective to all of these ecosystems, and wouldn't it be the way to force a lexicon, to force certain number of vocabulary definitions just to start with? So we'd like to have your views on that.
Yeah, so there's an English bank, I won't name them, that is the spin-out of another company. And they're an interesting use case because although they're part of a much older company, as a bank they're brand new, which means that they're not beholden to the legacy systems that they have in place prior. And one of the things that they're looking at is blockchain not as a currency exchange platform, but rather as a distributed authentication protocol.
Yes, sorry, I meant the DLT, not the personless.
Bitcoin,
yes.
But yeah, and hearing them go through their thought processes certainly makes it even more relevant in light of Equifax and everything that happened beyond that, where the concept of no individual entity owning the full picture, but rather elements of it being distributed, and the broader community participating in the authentication and calculation process opens up a number of interesting opportunities specifically around authentication. But then also, if you're able, at least in having the conversation with them, they then took it to the next level, which would be if there's also a way to marry distributed authentication into a global repository of threat data and a global repository of threat actor identity, does it also become possible for a bank, specifically this bank, to understand attribution, to understand actor with whom they're interfacing, and align trustworthiness either from a money laundering standpoint or a transaction into the bank itself or authorizing transactions from party to party and using that distributed calculation process for that goal? And so I think the answer is, at least based on what I'm hearing, the answer is yes. There's a very interesting documentary that just came out, or at least distributed on streaming platforms called Banking on Bitcoin that kind of goes through the history of Bitcoin, and it discusses how the financial services sector is embracing Bitcoin to create its own, or blockchain to create its own walled environment around cryptocurrencies, but also thinking if there are ways of using the concept of blockchain as a part of the broader computational processes that they follow. So I think the answer would probably be yes. That was a long way of saying yes.
Other members of the panel have thoughts?
I just hope that the ITU doesn't get that much involved with blockchain.
Can I ask why?
Oh, big headaches.
Let's discuss offline.
Other questions? Good. Thank you guys very much. Thank you all.